trainers, lords, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through the processes through which all animals learn, which we describe as learning theory. Now we're just going to talk through the first 3 levels today because those are the ones which are most important when training horses. So the first one is non-associative learning. When presented with a stimulus, the horse either habituates to it, they become more used to it, or they become sensitized. And of course we expect horses to habituate to pressure from the reins on our legs in contact, but also to react when we give them an aid. So I'm going to give you a scenario. A wheelie bin is placed so that you have to walk your horse past it every day on the way to the field. Now it doesn't flap, it doesn't fall over, nothing happens. Does your horse become habituated or sensitized? Well, it's a little bit of a trick question actually, because it depends. It is the individual perception as to whether something may be regarded as fearful or not. And you might think, well, that's silly. Surely if it doesn't do them any physical harm, then they shouldn't be frightened of it. Well, I'd agree, but I also can't understand why people are scared of spiders. Spiders do you no physical harm, and yet as people with higher cognitive ability, we continue to show fear responses towards them. So then we move on. So basically, you have to allow for the individual horse's perception and accept that. Then we move on to classical conditioning. I'm sure we all remember the story of Pavlov's dogs, whereby Pavlov would ring a bell and then he would feed the dogs. And after several repetitions, when he rang the bell, they would wag their tails, they would come to the front of the kennel all smiley. It's all about making associations and predicting what will happen next. Well, we can use this to our advantage. When riding horses, if we always give a postural cue before we give a cue from the hand or from the leg, it's like the postural cue is ringing the bell, the hand or the leg is like the food. So they learn to predict what will happen next. So then when you want to do medium trot in a dressage test, rather than having to use your legs all the way across, you just give the seat cue and it looks like you have invisible aids. This is also what a lot of natural horsemanship is based upon. Then we move on to the third one, operant conditioning. This is how an animal learns to operate, to function and interact with its environment. It's about rewards and consequences. And we split it into 4 different quadrants that people get very confused over. But just think, when we use the term positive, we mean the addition of something. So it's adding something, reinforcement to reinforce or train the behaviour we want. Negative means the subtraction or removal of something, reinforcement to train the behaviour we want. You can add something aversive, or you can take something nice away from the horse, which would be an example of punishment to stop a behaviour. Generally with horses, we use food for positive reinforcement training, or we may use stroking and scratching them. We know that that lowers their heart rate by about 10 beats per minute. Horses, although they don't necessarily mind it, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but horses will not work for being patted, they don't enjoy it, or being told that they're good. They don't like verbal praise. But timing is really, really important. So here is a case, as you can see, that was difficult for this owner to pick up the hind leg. And what you can see is when the owner lifts the leg up, she just lifts the other one off the ground. So trying to stop that behaviour is not going to be successful. So instead I train an alternative. I train her to lift her leg, and the click tells the horse that is the exact moment, that was the correct behaviour, that means you're going to get some food. So we've done a few repetitions at this point. Watch the difference now. She voluntarily lifts her leg, so I immediately click and go, yes, that's what I wanted. And then over time I said, no, not just lifting, you've got to hold it up as well to get the click and get the food. Now this was a case that for many months, the livery yard owner, the person that owned it, the farrier, were unable to do anything lifting this horse's hind feet up. And within 20 to 30 minutes of retraining, we could lift both hind feet up. Both feet were equally as bad. I've just shown you the example of the right hind. And you'll see she makes a mistake again now. That's perfectly acceptable. She's only been learning for 20 to 30 minutes and she's got all that other experience in her memory. So you just ignore the things you don't want and reinforce the ones you do. So then we move on to negative reinforcement. This is the bread and butter of dealing with horses. It's pressure release training. The pressure motivates, it should never cause fear or pain. The release reinforces that exact behaviour at that exact moment in time. So another example, This was a horse that had competed at FEI level endurance, had always been extremely needle shy. She had injured one of the vets, she had broke their foot. At an FEI event, she was pulled up for a random blood sample, and she actually reared up that high and fast, she went over backwards. And then a few weeks later, I was asked to go out and vaccinate her. So from the horse's perspective, she's thinking every time someone comes near my neck, the only way to make them leave me alone and not stab me is to rear up. So I just put my hand lightly on her neck. As soon as she stood still, I removed my hand. So we're removing the pressure to reward the correct response. So now she's starting to think, gosh, this crazy blonde vet, all the other vets that I deal with, I have to rear up to make them leave me alone. This one, I stand still and relax and she leaves me alone. Because of that, she gets more confident. So you can see I'm putting more and more pressure on with the cap needle each time. I would, of course, always wear a hat these days as well, but this is a very old video, so I apologise for that. And every time I put more pressure on, and now we actually take the cap off and give her the injection, and she thinks all I do is relax, and she'll leave me alone, and so she doesn't feel the injection. You get the behaviour you reinforce, not the one you want. So we need to identify how an unwanted behaviour is being reinforced and then reinforce an alternative. Now, obviously, we need to break that down into easy to achieve steps. Just the same as if you wanted a horse to event at 4 or 5 star, you don't start off over those fences. You start off much easier. Sure, this is a scenario that people have seen plenty of times. Small person, large horse, horse moves away. And there was no evidence of pain as an underlying cause in this case. So as a behaviourist, I would see this and say, well, the problem behaviour is that the horse swings its hindquarters to the right when it sees the mounting block. So it's really easy, isn't it, to solve? You just train it to swing the hindquarters left on command. Okay. So use pressure from the stick. As soon as the horse moves, release the pressure. I want the hindquarters to come towards me. So we put the horse against a wall to make it easy. Look at the amount of pressure I use with the stick in any of my videos. As soon as he makes an effort and leans, I stop, then ask a bit more until his feet move. And then give him that nice scratch. Now you found that one harder. So we're going to put him back against the wall and practice again. And we always start off just looking for the most basic attempt that a horse can offer. Now we want to practice it at the mounting block. So I walk him up at 90 degrees so he's not practicing swinging away. Lift the stick up, little tap. He makes any effort and I release that pressure. I go, yes, that was the right answer. A little bit more. Now the temptation at this stage is to get him perfectly lined up. I don't need that. He made a really good effort to move towards that block, so let's just lead him away from it again. Each time we ask for more and more and more. So you see, he swings away and then I'm not even having to tap him anymore. He's still fidgeting, he's not perfect. But again, you know, they'd had multiple people stood on the right-hand side of this horse to stop him moving, and they all went flying out of the way. Again, you can use a little bit of food just to make it a positive experience for him to want to stand at the block. And then we can finish with his owner, who's now able to position him where she needs to get on. Again, it's not perfect, but he has months of practicing the wrong behaviours and only maybe 30, 40 minutes of retraining. So at this stage, I'd like to invite Hannah to come up with me, and we're going to talk through another case scenario in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Gemma, and good afternoon, and thank you to Neff for the opportunity to come and share a little bit about the story of Gavin. Gavin came into my life about 6 years ago after a 2-day journey on the transporter's box. The middle picture is my little optimistic face, clutching the lead rope of my new horse, having unloaded him, and just prior to me turning him out into the isolation paddock. The yard where I was keeping him required horses to arrive, do a 2-week isolation period, followed by a blood test. Sounds pretty straightforward. Thankfully, on this occasion, I turned him out with a head collar, And the idea was that he'd spend those 2 weeks in the paddock, I'd get to know him, spend time with him, and then have the blood test taken so that he could join the main yard. I say the intention was because Gavin had some other ideas. And unfortunately, within hours of turning him out into this isolation paddock, Gavin had smashed through the fencing and joined the other horses who were not meant to be on isolation. As you can imagine, the other owners were not so thrilled with the prospect of this new horse joining them, but they were even less thrilled when it became clear the circumstances which we were now actually in. And those circumstances were we couldn't get within about 15 metres of Gavin. I mean, nowhere close. He would be at the back of the room at this point. And dearest little Gavin was scared of feed buckets. He was scared of fencing. He was definitely scared of me and my mum, who you can see in these slides, desperately trying to tempt him with a licket. So as you would expect, we tried several things. We tried penning Gavin using fencing, but he definitely smashed through it every time or chose to jump out. I definitely recall sitting for hours trying not to move, and the problem with that was every time I did, he of course moved in the opposite direction with quite a degree of pace. We also tried ACP. So once we got him used to a feed bucket, I tried in conjunction with my general practice vet a strong dose of ACP, which did help, but unfortunately, as soon as I then approached him and applied a pressure, again, he headed in the other direction. So we beavered away at this for 5 weeks or so. And as you can imagine, I was becoming increasingly frustrated, but as were my fellow liveries. And we got to the point where there were two options put in front of me as an amateur horse owner. The first was a dart gun from the zoo. And the second was a referral to Gemma Pearson. And thankfully, for little Gavin, option 2 was the one that we selected, and it was a decision that was to change the course of his life forever.
So from a behaviourist point of view, this is actually really simple to fix. The problem is fear of being caught. He's conflicted because he wants the food. But what happens is he comes up to Hannah, he gets the food, and then he steps away again, usually at speed. So that's increasing the distance. So that's negative reinforcement, removal of pressure. So I just did the opposite. When he came up and he started to take some feed, I would just slowly start to walk back away from him. So I was removing the pressure to reward him for standing still. We then increased that, so I then put a marker on it. I wasn't going to press a clicker with Gavin because I thought he might disappear to the other end of the field. So I used the verbal word good. And so he would come up to me. At this point, the food is now behind my back. And we were having to use a scoop to start with. He wouldn't take it out of the hand. So as he approached and stood still, I would say, good, offer him the feed. We then built that up to the stage whereby I could stand right next to him. I could kind of offer him my left hand, move it about a bit. If he didn't react, I'd say, good, give him the feed with the other hand. Second session, Hannah had been practicing in between. We could now scratch him with my right hand, so I would scratch him. If he stood still, I'd say, good, give feed with the left. And then just get to the stage of threading the leader up through the head collar, but we did not attempt to put any pressure on in that session. The third one, by this stage, he now marches across the field when he sees Hannah arrive. We could easily pass the leader up through. We did a bit of leading responses with him, and then I took the blood sample so everyone could come out of isolation.
So this video shows me practicing a little bit in the field. And I think the biggest thing that I would call out is I hope you can see from both the way he and I are interacting, but my expression in a second, how genuinely thrilled I am to have the tips of my fingers on my beloved new horse after 5 or 6 weeks at this point. We did make progress. So as I say, this was huge to be able to even hold my hand as I am on that head collar and interact with him briefly. And there goes the smile. At this point, he wasn't running away from me. And as Gemma said, we had taken the blood test. So I was back in favour with my fellow liveries, and I was able to take him down to the yard. And I thought, here we go, back to normality. Let's crack on and start working with this horse. Unfortunately, Gavin again had other ideas, and the next pressure or challenge that we encountered was a genuine fear of being stabled. Gavin demonstrated that by box walking, by body slamming himself against the walls of the stable and by rushing forward at the door when he made any attempt to go near him. And as you can imagine, that was really quite a dangerous situation, again, for an amateur horse owner to be in. So a bit like Ghostbusters, I knew who to call, and unfortunately for Gemma, within days, she got another call for some help.
So again, this is, a very common problem we see. He's practicing being fearful the same way people practice running away from spiders when they're fearful of them. And that was self-reinforcing. It was triggering the amygdala, the fear centre in his brain. So all we did was train calmness. So we trained him to stand still in somewhere he found easy, first of all, and train that calmness, that relaxation, built it up to doing it in the stable, to the extent whereby he would stand by his neck while we would go in and out of the door without him reacting to that.
So again, I thought, great, let's actually enjoy some time with this horse. And with the support of my coach, I broke Gavin in and I backed him. And I should be clear, we enjoyed some good times in the couple of years that followed. He had the basics of walk, trot, and canter, but what became very clear, and as you can see from these photos, was Gavin's response to pressure, which to him could mean a leaf in the wrong place, having got out the wrong side of bed in the morning, a cue from me that he didn't understand. His response was quite extreme. So it generally involved standing up on his back legs and rearing, but also included, as you can see on the right-hand side, the inversion of the neck, and then it often followed with a kind of rushing, running, and bolting behaviour. What was challenging as an amateur was this behaviour was getting progressively worse. So what I could anticipate him reacting to became increasingly difficult. And as I'm sure those of you who ride can imagine, it became something that really started to compound. The incident that triggered a further contact to Gemma was unfortunately a scenario in which Gavin reared, inverted his neck and ran, but this time he ran and hit a fence with me on him. So he had bolted to the extreme that I had absolutely nothing. And I think, again, most of you would probably reflect that at that point I knew somebody was going to get hurt if I didn't do something significant and work out exactly what was going on with the horse. I knew we could trust Gemma, but I also knew that Gemma, with her colleagues at the Dick Vet Equine Hospital, they would be able to understand and establish whether it was pain-related or whether it was another behavioural scenario that we were dealing with.
So this is actually a little bit of a video from prior to the extent where he actually hit the fence. This was filmed by Hannah's husband, and he did stop. You'll see at the end of this video, he kind of stopped because it was becoming progressively worse over time. And it was after that he bolted into the fence. And I think Hannah's husband put a little bit of pressure on to say, I don't want to become a widow, too soon, so we need to do something about this. From my perspective, there's lots of tension. The steps are really fast. He never, even in walk, he wasn't walking slowly. Lots of variation in head and neck position. He obviously wasn't slowing down from rein pressure. And the most concerning thing, as we've said, was that these were becoming increasingly dramatic over time. And he actually didn't score too highly on the ridden horse pain ethogram. And I would say, I've shown you a few cases today which are not painful, but the vast majority of cases I see have pain or some form of pathology as an underlying problem.
If I may, Gemma, I mean, for me, that's obviously difficult to watch, but that is, a very strong memory, unfortunately. So, yeah.
So first thing in terms of behavioural first aid, I said just well done for getting off and stopping, not continuing to train. Horses don't learn anything. They don't think they've won if you get off and stop a session. And we said, let's not ride again until we've assessed him. As we've said, we always like to investigate pain, and we had a comprehensive evaluation with myself and one of the orthopaedic specialists in the equine hospital. But from the history, there are a few antecedents which made me think that there may be some behavioural components to this. A new horse had been recently introduced into his field, so that may have meant he had elevated stress levels trying to cope with that different social situation. He may not have slept as well. There was an incident a few days prior to this where he'd napped and he'd been smacked just once with the whip, and he had rushed forward. And I thought he has probably perceived that rushing forward was the way to stop the smacking happen. So this is now a tool in his toolbox when he becomes tense. And the venue is not an easy venue at the best of times. It's quite exposed. I mean, it's a lovely venue, but it is exposed. And he already had a learnt response to being tense at that venue. So the problem is random accelerations, not slowing down when asked with the reins, and also separately the napping and rearing. So we just need to teach him to stop from a light rein cue and then teach him self-carriage. So if we ask for a slow trot, he can maintain that without being held. First session, after we'd had a look at him for pain, we went back to the in-hand exercises we did for the stabling. They're all associated with calmness and reinforced those. And we talked about him being like a pan of water, whereby we want to keep him at 15, 20 degrees in an easy environment, because it's always going to be elevated in a harder environment, and we want to stay way away from that pan boiling over. So initially, when I put my hands either side of his neck, as you can see in this picture, and pulled back on his mouth, there was no pressure whatsoever. So we retrained that, and you can see Hannah now, he's a bit distracted by something, but she puts rein pressure on and he immediately steps back. She releases the pressure, that's the remove reinforcement, and says good and gives him the feed. The first time Hannah got on him, I was stood right next to her because you were quite nervous at this point in time. But I was confident because it worked so well in hand that it would work under saddle.
Okay, go again.
So you can see again, he's actually distracted by other horses walking past, but she puts light rein pressure on. And he steps back, so she releases that pressure immediately. That is the key thing. And we know that the muscles you use for stepping backwards are the same ones that you use for bracing and slowing down. So the better a horse steps back lightly, the better they're going to slow down. We then wanted to work on his speed. So rather than him just getting faster and faster and faster,
okay, now
we said,
faster steps.
Let's go faster for a few steps, and you have to maintain that. Let's go slower for a few steps, and you have to maintain that as well.
Okay,
so we're teaching him to have some self-carriage.
Lovely. And now faster steps.
We need not forget about the equitation side of this. It's tempting if a horse runs away, you pull on the reins and you shove your seat into the saddle. But that's really uncomfortable on the horse's back. So asking Hannah to just lighten her seat as she cued him to slow down or stop makes it more comfortable for him and makes him more likely to offer the right response. A couple of weeks later, we built up to using trot as well. And we also then wanted to deepen the go response because we knew that when she put leg on, he often didn't go forwards. He actually didn't like her using her leg, so he'd go forwards without any leg, but if she did put leg on, he didn't like that. And that's where some of the problems came from. So again, I want you to look at how much pressure with the whip we use here. So no contact on his mouth, so it's really easy. Tiny taps.
Stop.
The millisecond I saw that foot move forward, we stopped and gave him a rub. Keep practicing this. He's like, yep, I know what that means. I can let the tapping stop by walking forwards. Now I want you to watch this time. We've classically conditioned it to the seat and a light leg cue. Look how light this cue is now. And he immediately walks forward. 2 weeks later, we rode him in the outdoor arena. What was really nice was we couldn't see because there was a big hedge there at the time, but we knew there was some building work going on before, and a truck tipped rubble onto the ground when Hannah was riding him. And he did shoot forwards, and she pulled on the reins, and he stopped. And that's why rein pressure is really important. It always has to go to the seat afterwards, and the voice if that's what you want, but the reins have to work because that's what you use in an emergency. We also taught him a little bit about the turn response, because when horses nap, people point the head and neck in one direction and the shoulder goes in a different direction. So teaching them that if you move your hand away from the horse's neck, I want them to move that foreleg away from their body that starts a turn response. But equally, if you almost neck rein, put your hand against the horse's neck, they move their shoulders away from that. So then you can use both reins to position the shoulders exactly where you want them. I want our hand and our leg cues to communicate with the horse's feet in the first instance, not with their head and neck position. So the really nice thing, a lot of cases I see, it's quite common as behaviourists, that people, when they start getting some success, stop practicing. With Hannah was not that case. Hannah continued to work with Gav. You can see from this video, she's now able to hack him out comfortably at this yard, and she continued to do it in other places. She then started going to easy venues, And within 12 months, she had gone back to the same venue where he'd bolted. There is still a new fence panel from where he had hit it in the first instance. And she qualified for the British Dressage Area Festivals at that venue. And I'll hand back to Hannah to finish.
Yeah, so this is understandably my favourite slide. This is Gavin the last sort of year to 18 months. And I think what's important to highlight from this slide is yes, a lot of the pictures are competitive and are us out enjoying our chosen discipline of British dressage. But actually, this little horse has brought us some incredible memories. He generally makes us smile on a daily basis. And I would be honest and say he is still tricky and still has a tendency to react in a challenging way to pressure. But the skills that Gemma and I have worked on with him and that Gemma has taught me has enabled me to go out and enjoy him and chase my dreams of British dressage. He now competes successfully at novice elementary, and we hope to go medium, dare I say, in a public forum by the end of the year. But hopefully there is just much more to come, and genuinely I cannot thank Gemma enough for her input to Gavin and to my journey. That's it.
Sharing that story of Gavin and your story. And I'd like to invite Dr. Tamzin Furtado to come up, who's a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Liverpool. And I'd like her to be part of this Unwanted Behaviours panel discussion, because I think it's important to introduce the elements of human behaviour change and the science behind that when we're talking about this whole area, because it is, as you can see, it's a combination of the horse and the rider and the owner that is important. So please put your questions into Slido. And in the meantime, I do want to ask, because I think it really is important, Hannah, can you tell me of your emotional side of going through all of that?
Yeah, thank you. So it's fair to say there was a lot of emotion involved, and I think one of my overriding memories is being terribly embarrassed that I had gotten myself into this situation, and that from where I was sitting, people were watching me struggle with a horse that I was struggling with and that I didn't quite know, didn't know how to handle. So I remember strong feelings of embarrassment. I remember moments of fear, particularly in the ridden work. I'm not ashamed to say that he did scare me on occasion. I think a degree of frustration, if I'm honest also, because much like I've been able to demonstrate our progress, I hadn't envisaged that taking 6 years, and I had always hoped that, it would be a fairy tale rather than some of the challenges that we did face. So I think probably those three elements.
And earlier I'd been talking to Hannah, and I think one of the things I was being impressed, having spoken to you, is how she didn't really get angry with Gavin. She understood it wasn't his fault, and I have to say, I'm very impressed. Do we have any questions from the audience? Any questions to Hannah? Could you stand and say who you are, please?
Sorry, Ian Heaton from Blue Cross. I have just put this on Slido, sorry, so I've duplicated effort somewhat. But I just wanted to ask the panel, really, do you think enough, I mean, it was a fascinating case study and incredibly impressive work and a lot of dedication, obviously, from all involved, but do you think enough is being done to educate riders and horse owners about learning theory in horses and when to use those different training techniques? And if not, then how do we go about changing that?
Really good question. Start with Gemma and then...
Yeah, okay, so yes and no, because I learned about learning theory about 20 years ago, and it was, like a completely alien language to anyone at that point in time. So where we are now, where we're having these conversations, we've made massive progress. At the same time, there's an awful lot more to do, and it's probably worth mentioning the Pony Club, which are now incorporating that into their test syllabus. they did in Australia as well. I think it is starting to get out, and things that happen slowly tend to be permanent. But yeah, we do need to keep promoting it.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that we have a very tradition-based culture in the horse world, so it can take a long time for changes to come through. But there's a lot that we can follow. For example, in the dog training world, I would say they're maybe a bit further forward in incorporating learning theory and a lot of training. So I think we can all play a role in sharing that knowledge. But also, I mean, part of it, as well as learning theory, is learning to moderate our own emotions and expectations of horses. So in relation to Hannah, for example, not becoming angry, but actually just wanting to understand Gavin and find out how she could work with him so that he didn't feel fearful. So alongside learning theory, I think that understanding of what horses are going through on an emotional level and how we can empathise, I think is really important. So even if you're not involved in teaching learning theory, for example, even just that basis, I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. I think the only thing I would add is that I think amongst amateur horse owners there's an increasing curiosity and open-minded attitude towards working differently. 6 years ago when we got Gavin, and I think I've said this to Gemma, you know, I think my other liveries were frustrated because they wanted their horses out that isolation paddock. But actually there was also a sort of dismissal of anything that didn't work instantly. So there was pressure from those other liveries genuinely to get the zoo in and to dart him because it would be instant. So I think increasingly there's open-mindedness and curiosity. But hopefully from sharing examples like this, it also opens the conversation in terms of working with challenging horses.
I'm sorry, can I just go slightly rogue and just add one more thing to that?
Yeah.
And it is slightly rogue, but the whole darting thing, I've dealt with a horse that was darted. People think they'll dart it and they'll then be able to catch it. It makes things 10 times worse. There are certain scenarios, particularly the charities, where they're rescuing horses and there's dangers of them on the roads and things like that, where, you know, it may be necessary. But if the horse is in a safe space, I've only ever seen it have worse long-term consequences.
And I just wanted to pick up on the livery yard, and Tamzin, ask you, because you were on a livery yard, how important are livery yards in this whole scenario?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting if we reflect on, I mean, Hannah's talked a lot about the emotional, what she felt about the emotions of working with Gavin, and she mentioned the word embarrassment. And if we reflect on what it would be like to be in the really difficult situation that she found herself in on a livery environment, where I'm sure many of us have been, compared to if you had your horse at home, the types of pressures that we would all feel are really strong, and especially in terms of those cultures and the traditions of, you know, oh, we just need to get on with it, not giving horses enough time and so on. Those can come through really strongly, and it's really important that we all kind of have a part to play in changing that, I think. So livery yards can have they basically create kind of individual cultures, individual microcosms where things can become very normal, and there can be peer pressures with that which can be negative, but equally I'm happy to say that there are some really positive sides. So one of the really nice things about Hannah's story is, for example, that she's made some lifelong friends as a result of being on a livery yard and as a result of her experience with Gavin and the highs and the lows of horse life that we all go through. So we can provide each other with so much support, but we have to be so careful, especially in livery yard cultures, to not make each other feel under pressure, because when you're experiencing something as difficult as Hannah did, or many of the situations we've all been in with our horses where we don't know what to do, when we're in that situation of panic, just putting pressure on people and telling them to kind of just sort it out or stop faffing around, you know, not take those slow approaches, can be really difficult for people and make it much harder to implement the learning theory principles that Gemma talks about.
Which are not slow.
Which are not slow. No, sorry. Thinking in the long term is what I meant, I guess.
From the floor, yep. Can you stand?
It's Eva Brumer from the World Breeding Federation for Sport Horses, British Breeding, and the Anglo-European Studbook. Sorry, lots of hats. I'm really struck by this presentation. Thank you very much, very thought-provoking. And one of the thoughts that occurred to me was that perhaps we should introduce more awareness at the early stages of horse evaluations. So at the moment, we don't really look at learning behavior as part of, for example, young horse classes or young stock evaluations. Do you see room there for improvement, and would this maybe help us gain a better understanding?
Yeah, so Janne Christiansen has actually published some nice work looking at temperament in young horses, and particularly how bold they are. And the horses that are more bold as foals, that's retained from pre-weaning to kind of yearlings and 2-year-olds, and they're faster to learn, so they're more trainable. But in terms of the gradings and things like this, and we touched on this earlier, in terms of showing and some other aspects, people often want horses to look dramatic, and they want them to, you know, be snorting and very alert and legs in the air. And that's often a stressed horse. Like, we do want horses that want to show off, that have that expression, but it's often taken to extremes, and people are then training them to be stressed and to be fearful as a habit, as a baby. I'd much rather see a young horse trot round looking relaxed in that environment with a more average looking trot, with the athleticism, of course, that you can work on, than something that's like a cat on hot tiles.
Anybody else? Otherwise,
No, that's fine.
perfect. I think there's a very, I'm combining a couple of questions here from Slido, but there's a concern, so how often, because there are training videos from people who are not experienced and perhaps not using them properly, so how often do you think some of these unwanted behaviours are because people are misapplying this behavioural type training?
Sometimes, not a lot, to be fair. I think there are elements of it, and I think you get that in any form. As soon as you say this is how you do it, people automatically can replicate, and it's done to greater and lesser degrees. I think I'd say I see less issues. Once people actually, that's the challenge, it's getting people to really understand learning theory, because people often think they're doing it, but actually what they're doing is not consistent with learning theory.
Any other? No, that's fine. So just another one we've got, sort of from a human behaviour perspective, what do we need to do? Because it's come up, how do we help people to better understand their horses?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's so many sides to that. I mean, I think the culture that we have in the horse world is our biggest, the biggest tool that we have at our disposal here. So making it a cultural norm to talk about understanding the horse from the point of view of, are they feeling, what emotions are they feeling that's contributing to the behaviour? Is it pain that's contributing to the behaviour? But making that a kind of cultural norm rather than the norm which I think we've had going back, is that we just have to make them perform the behaviour. So actually, how can we think in the long term? I think thinking about Hannah's example from a behaviour change perspective, one of the things that really strikes me is the Hannah's referred to it as stubbornness, but I would say dedication that she really showed in helping Gavin, but finding out what made him tick from his point of view, and also thinking in the long term. So with the example with catching him, she and Gemma have both spoken about how they didn't catch him on the first instance, even though they could have done. They could touch his head collar, but they thought about the long term and what was going to help him over the long term. So I think from a behaviour change perspective, being open-minded to doing things differently, but also thinking in the long term, rather than the short behaviours. How can we catch the horse? How can we load the horse? What can we do over the broader term to make their relationships with us better, which will inherently then help with those behaviours that we see as problematic.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add from a kind of owner perspective in that scenario is, I will never forget when Gemma caught him and then let him go. And I remember standing there going, "You dumb blonde vet, what are you?" Grab it! And yeah, I mean, I remember the feeling very specifically. And then Gemma walked back towards me and went, "That's good, that's all we're doing today." And I was like, "That's not all we're doing. I've got to get out of here," you know. But actually, the way that Gemma helped me break down the sessions, you know, I think you came out, two or three times? Yeah. But in between each, we were doing what I would call micro sessions of 20 minutes and then making some progress and then leaving him in the field again. So we were really building that up. But the long term, from an amateur perspective, was quite difficult to initially get my head around, because I suppose, like most folk, I was keen to make the progress. But yeah, to this day, touch wood, he has caught every single time since. So no matter the scenario, no matter what else is going on, he now catches, touch wood, very consistently. He probably won't tonight, now that I've said that. But, yeah.
Do we have another question from the audience?
I'm probably loud enough, to be fair.
We need to record. We need to record you.
Harsh but fair, from Her Royal Highness. Jeanette from the Horse Trust. Gemma and Tamzin, I hope we did the right thing, but from a behaviour change aspect of the Horse Trust, before you both came involved and we'd started playing at the edges of this, we started trying to stop negative semantics around horses. And I think that's a really simple step to stop labelling horses as naughty, stubborn, doing it on purpose, somehow malicious. They're not bright enough to be malicious. But we found that actually it really changed the way grooms were treating the horses because they weren't labelling them. And before that had been a real problem. Horses had almost been put in the naughty step.
Yeah, so interestingly, there's some really good research in the farm animal sector showing that the language people use has a massive impact on how they then behave around the animals. And I've actually shown that research with one of my MSc students, I just haven't published it yet, in horses. So people will often say, oh, I know I'm saying that, but I don't mean it. But actually, we do have really good evidence that the people that are using that language are interacting differently to the ones that don't.
Yes, I think it's really interesting. Language use is so important in how we interact with animals. And if in social science research, which I do, we often question people a lot on what they mean. And if they describe a horse as naughty and you ask, what do you mean by that? Generally what they mean is that the horse isn't doing what they want. So it's literally that, you know, there's so much more there that can be meant by the horse being naughty. But they often just don't realise until you kind of question a little bit more. So I think, yeah, absolutely, Jeanette, I totally agree. Kind of making it, normalising not using language like naughty, stubborn, difficult and so on, but really thinking, so why is that behaviour happening, will help us.
And Hannah, have the last word.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I was going to highlight is in the programme, the session is called How to Train Your Dragon. And we use that slightly to give me a different set of terms that I could use affectionately with my toothless, as I call him, so that when he was having a challenging day or when I wasn't getting the right behaviours that I thought I was cueing, it gave me something to kind of smile about and default back to. So thankfully the dragon days are generally behind us, but he will forever be toothless because he's genuinely missing a front tooth. So.
So unfortunately, I have to draw this absolutely fascinating discussion to a close. Sorry for those. Do have a chance afterwards to try and talk to Hannah. And I'd like to thank Hannah, Gemma and Tamzin, and of course Gavin, for being part of this valuable part and session of any. Thank you.